Welcome to the Power Trends podcast, produced by the New York Independent System Operator, where we discuss energy planning, public policy, and other issues affecting New York's power grid.
Hello, and welcome to the Power Trends podcast. I am Kevin Lanahan, your host, Vice President of External Affairs and Corporate Communications at the New York Independent System Operator. And once again, we are hosting Zach Smith, Vice President, System and Resource Planning, to talk about a very important subject on this episode, the interconnection and class year study process. Before we dive in, I think it's important to note that your team is regarded as, when we talk about the authoritative source of the New York ISO, you folks are really at the heart of that. And what we're going to discuss today has so many connections and implications to authoritative source, reliability, how the grid is running, transition today. We're all finding ourselves in. So we appreciate you being with us.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kevin. It's something I take great pride in, the team that we have and the experts that we have in so many areas of this industry. It's incredibly complex, and we need all the right expertise, and I'm really proud to say that we have it, but we have a lot of challenges ahead of us.
Yeah, so those are the themes of the discussion today. Let's dive right in. If folks are not familiar with the interconnection class year process, this is the process by which generation, transmission, major load projects of a certain size are studied, analyzed from a reliability perspective for the impact on the bulk electric system. Let's start with the basics. When folks ask you what the interconnection process is, how do you describe it from a high level? What are we talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. The interconnection process consists of many pieces, and really the objective is about the reliability of the grid, being able to integrate new resources into the grid as we're transitioning to a renewable future, to a storage, and all the different resources that we need to meet the state's policies. We need to make sure that we do that in a reliable way. That means that as we connect these new resources, they don't do anything to degrade the performance of the system, so that we can keep the lights on, keep the quality of service for all customers in New York without anything happening to any of their service and to any of the equipment that's already connected to the grid. That's really the core objective of the interconnection process. The interconnection process itself is structured in multiple phases. It consists of up to 3 studies: a feasibility study, an impact study, and a facility study. And you mentioned the class year. The class year is that final step, the facility study, where we group projects together to understand what is the cumulative impact, what's the joint impact that those projects have with each other on the grid, to make sure that as those projects come online, we can still maintain the reliability of the system. It has gotten so much more complex because of the volume of projects. We have so many more projects now that we're evaluating all at once. And you also mentioned the technology. The technology has changed, continues to change. And with that change in technology, we have to have an understanding as to what the impact could be. Many of these new resources, be it wind, solar, storage, many of them, if not all of them, are inverter-based. From a technology standpoint, it basically just means you have power electronics. You have these technologies that may interact with each other and may interact with the grid, sometimes in a negative way. We've actually seen this in other systems. There have been recent events in Texas that have caused significant loss of these resources, and it's because of the interactions of inverter-based resources. We have to be very mindful of that. We have to be mindful of that as we're looking at their sole impact on the system and then their joint impact on the system, and that's really the purpose of the class here.
You know, it's good in one sense that the CLCPA has created incentives for projects to come to us and say, we want to connect to the system, please perform these reliability studies. So the CLCPA is working in that sense. At the same time, you mentioned the volume. Talk about how that volume has changed in the last 3 years. I think I saw something from your group that the number of projects have tripled. How many projects do we have in the interconnection queue altogether right now?
Active projects, we're at about 500. We're approaching 500 active projects right now. It's a tremendous volume, and it has doubled, tripled over time. I've been here for nearly 20 years now, a few years short of 20 years, and when I first started, we were at maybe a dozen active projects, and so now we're approaching 500. It's incredible. And it is driven by CLCPA, by state policies incentivizing the integration of these resources, which is great. And our process needs to make sure that it's done in a reliable way. We've touched on that on some of the other podcasts, thinking about what is the interaction of these resources with the grid as a whole. and what other resources do we need. We've talked before about dispatchable emission-free resources, or you might hear us say DFRs. That is acknowledging that you have all of these wind and solar and storage, but that may not be all the grid needs. The interconnection process is a part of that overall assessment to consider, can we integrate all of these while still keeping the lights on?
So number of projects has tripled in roughly 3 years. We're talking about 500 projects in the interconnection queue. All of these projects have to be studied and analyzed to one degree or another. What are some of the steps that your staff has to go through to make sure that they have all these questions answered about how these projects, these machines, these assets are going to react and perform once they connect to the system?
Yeah, a key aspect of it, let me acknowledge who else is involved. So it's not just my staff. Of course, we have many consulting firms that are helping us out from a workforce standpoint. But it's very important the interaction that we have with the developers themselves, the support that they provide, and the utilities who own the grid and the facilities for which these projects are connecting to. And really what we need to consider through the class year and through the interconnection process, first of all, how do you actually interconnect? Literally, how do you plug in a new wind farm or solar farm into the grid? There's a design associated with that, and that's a key step in the process. Then once you figure out how you're going to plug it in, how does that interact with other projects around it? You may have multiple wind, solar, storage facilities all in the same vicinity, and even in that local area, they may have interactions with each other. And then you have to look at the broader grid, the New York grid as a whole. What type of impact might you have? For example, projects may interconnect in such a place where it may limit our ability to move power across the grid. We call it transfer capability. What's our ability to move power from one part of the grid to the next? We need to maintain that for the sake of the reliability of the system. And there are cases where, depending on the interconnection design, depending on the type of resource, there is the potential for that to be degraded. And we need to maintain that, and thus the interconnection process, really the objective in the end. If you cannot maintain reliability with the projects interconnecting, identify what upgrades are needed to, in fact, maintain reliability. So the answer in the end is always, we will get these integrated. It's a matter of how. It's a matter of what upgrades do you need, and then identifying who's responsible for those upgrades and allocating costs for them.
Okay, so there was a lot of important points there. Let's take the last one first. We're not in a position of saying yes and no. That's not our role. Our role is to say how
That's
to
correct.
do so safely and reliably. And that's the end result that we're trying to work towards.
That's exactly right.
So one thing that makes that complex, and you were just talking about it, that I want to explore a little bit more is, where and how to connect to the grid. I think some people who may not be so familiar would think, oh, that's just an easy goal to accomplish. Mm-hmm. You create a project and you plug in somewhere. It doesn't matter where. But the grid is almost like a living, breathing organism on its own, and you change things here, it can have implications elsewhere you may not have considered or anticipated.
That's absolutely true. And it's not only true for New York. New York is part of an interconnected machine across the entire eastern half of the United States. So, we are all one big machine connected with New England and Pennsylvania and all the way really to the Midwest, through the Midwest. And through our studies, through our analysis, we need to work with our neighbors as well. In New England, to the south, the organization's PJM, also our Canadian neighbors. We need to work closely with all of them to understand, is there anything that's happening in our system, in the New York grid, that could potentially impact their system? And we have an obligation to that as well. And they do the same for us. They look at interconnections in their system and they give us a call and say, hey, is this a concern for you?
So that again highlights the complexity and the criticality on the reliability front. The other thing that you mentioned a moment ago that we should explore and highlight is we're one entity. If you disagree with this analogy, then tell me. But we're in some ways we're like an orchestra conductor, and we've got various different other parties that have to be involved in this: the local utility, local governments and communities, et cetera. So, that adds to, that's a difficult task to manage all of that.
It's complicated. You have not only the engineering side that's complicated, you have the administrative side and the coordination side. So we have a project management team that's focusing in on coordinating the utilities, the developers, any neighboring systems, everyone who needs to be involved in the process, making sure that they are well coordinated, aware of what needs to get done, keeping track of timelines. We're working on improving all of that. And then your shop, Kevin. Let me give them some acknowledgement. We're
Yeah,
setting up we're setting up a call center, to help us out on fielding any questions. And we want to be responsive to the concerns of developers, responsive to the concerns of policymakers, and everyone who is backing the achievement of the CLCPA, and making sure that we're a key part of that, and doing everything that we can to support that achievement.
Yeah, and I want to get to that part of the discussion as well. Before we do, now let's talk about the actual work, because that's where a lot of the hours are directed. So we've got 3 major successive studies, and then there's a lot of information that has to be transferred back and forth between the parties. It's complex information. And then the type of information that gets transferred back and forth, all of this to serve the integrity of the process. So let's walk through the types of questions, information, tasks that your team has to accomplish in order to get to that end goal.
Yeah, the process starts with interconnection request from the developer, and that's really key to the whole process, not just from an administrative standpoint. For us to properly evaluate any given project, we have to understand the nature of that project. So, of course, it starts with, is this wind? Is this solar? Is it storage? Something else? But then we need to understand all the technical details around that. And that all comes from the developer.
Okay, so they're putting a project proposal in front of you. You get that. You start to dig in, understand it.
We dig into the machinery specs, what their preliminary thoughts are in terms of the interconnection. We have iterations with the developer talking about that documentation they've provided us on the front end. When that gets to the right place, then we bring in the utilities and we start talking about, okay, well, what's the initial thoughts on how to interconnect this? And then the utility will weigh in depending on what their design criteria is, depending on what's needed in that system. For example, New York City has more stringent requirements than, say, other places in upstate New York.
And the utility, from a distribution system point of view, knows their infrastructure, so that's why they have to take a look at the impacts there and give you and your folks the results of their work.
That's exactly right. I mean, the New York ISO, we are not facility owners on the electric grid. The utilities all own these facilities that are being interconnected to, and therefore they are the experts when it comes to this design. So we work hand in hand with them very closely. Their role is incredibly important as we work together with all of these parties. So on the front end, that interconnection request, we work all together. We have what's called a scoping meeting to scope out, okay, what's this project look like? What's important to evaluate? Using our engineering judgment, using our expertise, we determine this aspect might be a concern, that aspect might be a concern, let's dig into it further. And then that's really the purpose of that sequence of studies I described. Feasibility study, impact study, ultimately leading to a class year facility study.
Okay. So let's talk about, because this subject comes up, project design. Sometimes you're getting project designs, and some are more fully realized, should we say, than others. And sometimes when we get those projects that aren't necessarily as fully realized, that's where a lot of back and forth has to be had.
That's very true. We offer the feasibility study as an option, where a developer can utilize that to explore different possibilities depending on how developed their project is. Some developers come in with a fully baked idea, fully designed, at least in their mind, and then that can maybe go through the process a little bit faster. Others aren't so sure, and so they come in with different options. The process as it stands today, it provides for either one of those tracks.
So fair to say, not as fully realized, that can add hours?
It certainly can, yeah. And that leads to the overall time frame of the entire interconnection process. So, there tends to be focus on how long the class year takes or how long an impact study takes. And each one of those time frames are incredibly important. But in my mind, what's really important is the time from an interconnection request to the time when that developer is signing the interconnection agreement. If expediency is important to people, that's really what we need to be focusing on. We need to focus on that in terms of how we think about our process in the future. And we ask that everyone involved, the developers, the utilities, and any of our stakeholders, that we all be thinking about that together. How can we conduct a process in the most expedient way while still achieving the same objectives?
So there's 3 things to consider and balance out here as we move forward and we take a look at efficiencies. One is, well, we're talking about it now, right? Time to completion. but then making sure that if we can achieve those efficiencies and time to completion a little faster, reliability is not in any way sacrificed.
That is paramount.
And then you're talking about, use the word flexibility. There's flexibility built into our process. And while that might help the developer and maybe, provide certain benefits, we have to balance that amount of flexibility out because it's going to be hard to achieve both a quicker time frame, more efficiencies, and flexibility. If you got some thoughts there.
That's absolutely right. Over the years, we've modified the interconnection process a number of times, and oftentimes it's been in the direction of greater flexibility. So as a result, we have an optional feasibility study now. We have an impact study that culminates in non-binding findings. So really, it leaves everything to the class year. As a consequence, we have seen recently, in the most recently completed class year, we had 50-plus projects that started it. Only about half of those ended up finishing the whole study, accepting their cost allocation and posting security. And part of that, this isn't the sole driver, but part of that is the flexibility that came before that allowing for projects to proceed on through the interconnection process without being sure about some of the complications. We even had the circumstance of physical infeasibility as part of the class year, where we actually found in that late stage of the interconnection process that a project may not be able to actually physically interconnect to the grid. That's something that I've flagged as a useful example of something we need to think about for our interconnection process going forward. A lot of time was spent in the class year trying to address that issue, trying to address a number of other issues that are sort of similar. Could those have been addressed earlier? Could we structure our process in a different way than it's structured today, such that we can nail those down early on in the process? So then when we get to the class year, we're looking at projects that are a little more firm, a little more thoroughly designed.
So now you're taking those groups of projects, as we pointed out in the beginning, much more diverse these days in terms of technology. You're running modeling. You're seeing how they interact with one another. Different parts of the grid and different parts of the state where there's different load centers and demand characteristics, et cetera, and finding out where some of those reliability issues might pop up. And then sharing those results with the groups of projects, right? And so then take it from there. What else is part of that
That's
we
right.
all need to focus on?
It all culminates in the class year report. And, without boring our audience with all the technical details, it's looking at fault current capabilities on the system. In other words, we all have a breaker box in our house. Well, the grid has some really big versions of that. And we need to make sure that the breakers can handle the load or the generators that we're connecting to the system. So that's a key aspect of the evaluation. You need to look at whether the wires across the system, the transmission lines, can handle the movement of power that's going to interconnect to them, and what problems might that cause. You need to worry about how the machinery interacts with each other and how that could cause, we call it instability of the grid. That's the worst case, where it actually could lead to the generators tripping offline. It could lead to ultimately blackouts. So those are the kind of things we need to look at, and it's looked at cumulatively among all of the projects, ultimately in the class year report that we publish. Once we publish it, that identifies upgrades on the system if they're needed, attributes those upgrades to the projects that cause the need for the upgrade. So through our analysis, we determine this subset of projects are driving the need for this upgrade. The upgrade could be putting in a new breaker, reconducting a transmission line, building a new transmission line.
Expanding a substation.
There's all kinds of things like that that could be a quote-unquote upgrade. The cost estimates are established for those upgrades. We determine the cost responsibility on a project-by-project basis based on who drove the need, and then each developer is faced with that decision at the end of the class year process. Do they accept or reject their cost allocation? And we go through iterations until everyone accepts. And if you reject, well then, you might hear the shorthand of us saying, you've dropped out of the class year. So if you reject your cost allocation, you can then move on to another class year depending on the circumstances.
That doesn't mean you're gone forever.
Doesn't mean you're gone forever.
Right.
Every developer has different options. It just kind of depends on the circumstances. But all of this is about the developer understanding what their cost responsibility is going to be. Does that seem reasonable to them? Is the timing right for them to accept those costs? If it is, they accept, and then they can move on and sign an interconnection agreement.
Okay, so we're looking at these projects through this process individually to make sure that they can do what they purport to do together and reveal the impacts on the system and the impacts these machines and these projects are going to have on one another once they all connect, finding out, based on what those impacts are, what the upgrades are to the system to keep it reliable and safe on behalf of consumers, and then giving them an estimate. It's more than an estimate. This is a figure, and it's
a binding figure that they are agreeing to.
Right.
And let me emphasize, it takes a lot of engineering work to come up with what we believe is the least cost upgrade. So
it's not just highlight that.
Yeah. It's not just about finding something that might work. It's about going through some real scrutiny through our engineering team, including our consultants, including the utilities, including the developers, and understanding, well, what is the right solution here at the least cost, so that we're not burdening the developers, with undue costs.
So this is a really important point. So working really hard to find that least cost solution. We're not slapping something together. So trying to make it as affordable, in one sense, for the developers so that they will move forward.
That's right.
But at the same time, making sure that those costs are not borne by consumers. That's another inherent benefit to the system and the way we run it.
That's exactly right. When you've heard me describe cost allocation, you'll notice you didn't hear me say cost allocation to ratepayers.
Right.
It's what we're doing here is understanding what impact does a given generator or a collection of generators have on the grid, identifying that, coming up with a cost estimate for that, and allocating that to the generators.
Okay. So huge responsibility. Your team, like I said, we just got through one of these class year processes. Let's talk a little bit about what was in that particular class year, some initial takeaways after completing it that you and your team are focused on. And then let's talk about, after that, we'll dig into some more improvements. You talked about the 2019 improvements. I want to get to some of the more current ones.
Sure. So the current class year that wrapped up, it started with 57 projects. We ended with 20-some, I believe 26 projects. It included wind, solar, storage, some exciting projects in there. Offshore wind was included. We have the Champlain Hudson Power Express project coming down from Canada. That's been a core focal point within the state policy to meet renewable and emission-free goals.
Big class year from this perspective.
Very big class, from any perspective.
Yeah.
It was a big class year from a volume perspective, just the number of projects that we had to deal with, but a big class year from any number standpoint. The amount of power that we're going to be adding to the system as a result of this class year, it's in excess of, I believe, 7,000 plus megawatts coming onto the grid.
Majority of which is emissions-free. And
almost all of it.
Yeah. Share any observations coming through this one, because we're wasting no time. Started a new one, almost immediately began the steps to start the process for another one.
We're mindful of lessons learned no matter what process we're working on. So lessons learned with this class year is being focused on some of the issues that can possibly delay the process. What can we do better going into the next one? So being mindful of physical infeasibility, being mindful of interactions that might happen between the projects, prioritizing our work, our consultants' work, the utilities' work, such that we identify those as early as possible in the class year process so that it's not left us a surprise at the end and thus delaying the process. So that's very much what we're focused on, seeing how this past class year played out and doing everything that we can within our tariff, within our procedures to make this next class year even better. But that really gets to some of the reforms that we're thinking about as well.
Yeah, so let's dig into that. I mean, we're running focus groups now to interface with the developers, understand what their ideas are to create efficiencies. But we're also speaking back to them and saying, we need your help as well. That's the nature of the focus groups. I think that we've had over 150 companies, individuals, entities attending those. So it's been a robust discussion. Like you said, a lot of lessons learned. But let's talk about your team, some of the staffing changes that are being made there, investments that are being made there to address some of the feedback we're getting.
Yeah, we've had great engagement from the stakeholders, great feedback, and we always value that. Part of that feedback throughout the past year or so has been, what support do they need from us to better administer the process, to better understand the process. And so we've added resources within my team, we've added resources within your team, Kevin, to address project management and to better administer the process overall. Also to focus on some of the tools that we provide to stakeholders and developers. You'll hear us talk about a portal. Really, it's a website that has specific information about any given project, A developer or any party involved in the process can log in, check out the status of their project, check out where their study stands, who's waiting on what. We're working on developing all of that.
So we're focused on people. We're focused on processes, and we're focused on technology.
That's right. And there's the broader picture that we'll start talking with stakeholders about here very soon. Very recently, we had a stakeholder meeting talking about the broader process as a whole. So the interconnection process I've described, it's all driven by our federal tariffs, federal law that says we shall conduct an interconnection process in this way. We have the ability through our stakeholder process to propose modifications to that tariff, to that law. And this year, 2023, we intend to pursue improvements to that process. We have our own thoughts as to how things could move faster, how things could move more efficiently, so that we're not leaving so much work to the class year. If we spread out the butter, across the interconnection process throughout the time frame, we think it can get through a little bit faster than what we've seen in the past. The problem is we need to modify the federal tariffs. We need to modify federal law in order to do that. So for us to do that, we need to bring a proposal to our stakeholders. We need to talk to all of them, get their feedback, get their thoughts, suggestions, get them on board with whatever proposal we ultimately go with. And once they're on board, then we file it with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and hope that they approve it. There's a lot of push across the nation, not just here in New York,
right,
to change the interconnection process, to improve it. We've seen it in some of our neighbors and our counterparts with them working towards improving their interconnection process. We want to do the same here, but we want to do it for New Yorkers.
In other regions of the country, other RTOs have put a halt, a pause, should we say, on their process because there's been too many.
I talked to my counterparts from across the country. We're all wrestling with the same problem. Everyone has different flavors of the problem, but it is all the same problem. The tremendous volume of new interconnection requests, nearly all of it being renewable or emission-free. And how do you get it integrated into the grid reliably, and how do you handle the volume on a timely basis? And yeah, some of our counterparts across the country, they have taken some pretty drastic steps. We're working darn hard here in New York to keep things moving along. But I will say I recognize some people's frustrations at times, and we're working really hard to address those.
Yeah, and I just have to put out there, we know that your folks worked overtime, deep into multiple nights, holidays,
They did.
To close this class year down.
They did.
It has been an incredible display of dedication for sure. What we haven't talked about is increased load, big load projects. There's one that's been in the headlines, the Micron chip fab project announced in central New York near Syracuse. It's been a focus of President Biden, Governor Hochul, Chuck Schumer, and that is an enormous project. That's also going to have implications. And there's other similar projects, maybe not in that magnitude, that we also have to study and take a look at for impacts. Thoughts there, because that's also something to consider.
Yeah, we've seen a real increase in what we used to call industrial load. You could still call it that, but it's a whole new technologies, a new version of industrial load. As you mentioned, we have the Micron project that's coming forward. Very large facility. It'll be a very large demand, singularly located in a specific part of the grid. And that part of the grid was not originally designed for that. And so the question is going to be, can that grid handle that demand in such a singular location? We have a process very similar to our generator interconnection process to evaluate, we call them loads, large loads on the system, like that Micron project. And as you mentioned, Kevin, there are other projects as well for data centers, cloud computing. Anything regarding computing can lead to large cooling load, can lead to, in other words, electrical load, real draws of power on the grid, on the system.
Maybe not as well known in the headlines as Micron, but impacts nonetheless.
That's right. And it is across New York and especially upstate New York. So as these new data centers and chip fabs plug in to the grid across upstate New York, it's going to very quickly use up any surplus power we have in upstate New York. And it also will put stress on the transmission grid to move power from one place to where these loads are interconnecting. As I mentioned, we have an interconnection process to address that. It's similar but different from the generator interconnection process. But you mentioned the Micron. We've seen that in the headlines. I anticipate that they will have to go through our interconnection process. And when they do, it's the same consideration, reliability of the grid. But us being here for support to get them through that process, to figure out how to get it done. We're not here to say no. We're here to say, here's how you have to do it in order to maintain reliability of the grid. But it's going to be a whole new challenge for us going forward. Very clearly, there's a number of these facilities across New York State.
Right. Like you said, in support of the project and making sure that they can site there safely, again, reliably, and bring those jobs to Central New York.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, again, thanks for your participation in the fourth one of these podcasts. This was a really important discussion. Might have you back to talk about it again at some point in the future. Congratulations to you and your team on this latest class year. Thank you for the dedication. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Happy to be back anytime.
Thank you for joining us. As a reminder, the New York Independent System Operator, NYISO for short, is responsible for reliably managing New York's power grid and energy markets and providing independent data to policymakers and the public. For more independent info, please visit the NYISO blog at www.nyiso.com/blog.